he shall come to drudge for a living and be paid. Is that not wonderful?
It's fantastic.
I mean, I've got an exclamation point right next to it.
It's the most memorable conversation you've had about James Joyce.
You know, that is so interesting because the opening question that I got is, what is the most memorable conversation that you have had about Bloom?
Okay. And what's the distinguishing thing between those? Because I found I started saying that, like exactly the wording that was on there. And I don't know, I feel like people almost like the first couple of people I interviewed anyway, kind of saw them as synonymous. It was like, oh, Bloom, Joyce, the same thing. But I don't know. Is there two that stand out to you? What's the difference between talking about Bloom and talking about Joyce?
Oh, yeah. That in itself, I think, is a really good question. Well, they're both literary creations in my mind, okay. Both James Joyce and of course, Leopold Bloom. But from two different worlds, if you will. One I associate kind of as real, and that is Bloom. And the other one I associate almost as fictional, and that is James Joyce.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, because I've read Ulysses now just a couple of times. You're gonna talk to people who, I mean, they'll quote everything that you want to hear from Ulysses, but Leopold Bloom is very real, and there's a very real kind of component to him. So that's why I would say, Joyce is fictional and Bloom is real.
Wow. So how does that change, like, how you talk about them?
Oh, right now I'm reading Ulysses with a bunch of people who are centered in Sweeney's pub, and you got a hold of Valeria. Yeah. And so we just read a couple of weeks Sirens, I think it's episode 11. And I was struck by how profoundly sad and understandably so Bloom was, and I noticed. I know this might sound strange that more women seem to see that sadness, readily see that sadness, than men, for whatever reason. I think they might see it, but they don't want to necessarily talk about it, And because most of the time people want to talk about the brilliant language that Joyce uses rather than the profound depths of emotion that seem to arise. But so that was the last conversation I had of real substance about Bloom, and whether or not Molly is really going to have an assignation, shall we call it, with Blazes Boylan. Bloom thinks that it's going to take place, and it's happening in Bloom's mind, just like all this stuff happened in James Joyce's mind, and they happen in their own way in my mind, And but I'm not quite sure she does go through with it. I'm not quite sure it does happen. Okay. So but I can identify with the profound sadness that Leopold Bloom feels at the possibility of it happening and anticipating it happening. I think at even one point in that episode, he almost sobs, Mm-hmm. So it's just profoundly sad to me.
Yeah, I don't know, that reminds me of like the first ever, like just for my bachelor's, I wrote kind of like a mini thesis on Ulysses. And I remember talking, like my supervisor and I had like quite a lot of candid discussions about that, actually, of how like, when the first not criticisms, but like the first reviews of Ulysses came out, and a lot of people were focusing on that more like, holy crap, like why can people see themselves? And like Joyce apparently was kind of expecting everyone to read it as a comedy and like focus on the humor of it and stuff. And so I think it's, like you said, with Joyce being fictional, it's almost like his assumption that everyone would focus on the humor almost kind of makes you wonder, like, how he managed to get in all of that, like, deep, dark, bottom of your heart emotions, but they're there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think he paints a real picture of, the complex thought that goes on, and not just thought, but the complex, I don't know, just occurrences, the physical occurrences that happen in a human body, the mental occurrences, whether you want to call them thoughts, passing fancies, or whatever, influences. And so I think if you paint a rich enough picture like that, you don't necessarily have to feel those feelings yourself.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
So I think he does a great job of that. I don't think of Bloom and Joyce as being the same any more than I think of Stephen Dedalus and James Joyce as being one and the same.
Okay.
Or Daedalus's father, or any other character, the dead person in there, or any of those people. I don't consider them to be the same as Joyce.
Who is James Joyce, and maybe like how do we define him through our understanding that he isn't his character? So.
Oh yeah, that's also a good question. One of the things that I especially got just from because I read, the only way I think you can read Joyce is with a group of people. I don't think it's possible to really read it by yourself,
I agree.
And so I first attempted Finnegans Wake when I was in my 20s, just like I first attempted Ulysses by myself.
Wow.
Yeah, but you did. You've read it. You're obviously in your 20s, and you've already read him a couple of times, so that's not an astonishing fact in itself. But I was just propelled out. It was almost like repelled out of the books because I couldn't make any headway. And of course, the chapter in the Proteus chapter the third episode, bam, out I go. Right.
Yeah,
tried it a couple times. Out I go. Now it is my favorite by far episode in Joyce.
What changed?
In Ulysses. What I gained out of Finnegans Wake, which is puns at the highest level of art, right?
Okay.
And which in Ulysses he talks about metempsychosis, And it started me thinking about maybe there's a metempsychosis event of a word, right?
Okay.
Where all of a sudden a word now takes on a meaning of a word that sounds like it, and it takes on that soul quality of that word that sounds like it, And so Joyce just puns throughout Finnegans Wake, and that punning takes place on a historical level, where he'll pun, King Canute with somebody else, But as he does that, you enter a different epoch. You enter a different culture, a different time frame, and everything else. And I think he just did that. And the main theme I see in there is he's having an argument, in my mind, with his aesthetic of art, with Lessing's aesthetic of art. Where Lessing is he's that great German literary critic and playwright from the 18th century, and there's a vague reference at the beginning of Proteus to something that Lessing wrote in Laocoon, right? Which is in itself is an interesting title. It's a Trojan priest who is slaughtered, but it doesn't appear in the Odyssey. It comes in the Aeneid, right?
Okay.
And then he riddles the whole chapter with all these heretics, these Greek priest heretics, etc., contrasting them at times with the Orthodox person, if you will. The same thing, the way he contrasts the Orthodox father, his own, with an unorthodox father, his uncle, right? He even has one quoting from opera, and then the other one quoting from the light opera that is the contrasting thing with it, Wow. And it just goes throughout. And so once I saw that in Finnegans Wake, it just made it all come alive in Proteus, And so what's nice about it too is, I learned about Lessing. I had never heard of the guy, I'm not literature person, so I don't know these people, but I just got fascinated by him. Lessing wrote a play about a Jew, Nathan the Wise, that you can still read in English, and here's a sympathetic portrayal of a Jew from an 18th century German playwright, and was one of the first sympathetic plays about a Jew. So here we have Joyce writing with the protagonist of his sympathetically protagonist is a Jew in the middle of Dublin. So I just looked at it as he was having some kind of, throughout that third episode, he was having a dialogue with these great minds from the past to establish his aesthetic theory, and it made me think about, well, what's my idea? What's my idea of an aesthetic theory? What's my idea of beauty? So he profoundly affected me in that way. And one of the nice things about it is I found some crazy tangent of my own that is only interesting to me, and that's all Finnegans Wake is about. Is these crazy tangents that were only interesting to Joyce, or that then became interesting to a lot of other people, but all through punning, it just punned. As a person, his life to me was also profoundly sad. His daughter was afflicted with schizophrenia or whatever she had. I'm not sure how happy his marriage was. You think about him as an expat living in Paris, writing in excruciating minutiae about his hometown, right? So here he is in the City of Light, during one of the heights of the literary period at the time, writing about Dublin. And so did he miss it? What ghost was he visited by? And so as a real person, I think he did experience a lot of sadness in his life.
Yeah. For sure.
But he also created immense joy for other people too.
Yeah, it's such interesting, the parts of his life that he was willing to put into, I think, especially Ulysses, that we the moments that we know are biographical, and it's just geez, how did you share that with the world? I could never. Even if that did happen to me, I'd be never tell a soul. Here he is putting it in his masterpiece.
Another parallel with Lessing. Lessing was one of the first Germans to write about the middle class, the bourgeoisie, without having to have somebody from nobility be the heroic figure.
Okay.
And they were all people from the middle class that he wrote about. And you could argue that Joyce has, he's written about both lower and middle class people without having to have upper class heroic figure. So, so he's writing to 98% of humanity when he writes like that,
Yeah. Do you think, with the difficulty of Ulysses, who do you think he wanted his readership to be? If it's sort of for all these people, it's not for just the higher class anymore, but also it's, sends you to the library a lot.
Yeah, he's writing for the literate class for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's an interesting time too, because arguably we're in a post-literal world, literate world, And if people read, it's kind of rare. I think that's why you want to talk about Joyce, because of all your friends, you're a literature major, I would assume. Is that right?
Yeah.
So you have a ton of literature friends, right?
Oh yes.
Not many of whom really want to talk about Joyce that much, right?
Yeah, they'll tell you they have been forced to become my Ulysses reading groups. So a lot of them have, unfortunately, I think, against their will, become Joyce fans.
Have you ever read Marcel Proust?
No, I haven't. It's been on the list forever.
Yeah, he bounces people out of his work too. Right at the very first episode, he writes endless pages about the difficulties of falling asleep. Right.
Ah, joy.
In Search of Lost Time, the very first novel of In Search of Lost Time, I think it's Swan's Way. And so you either quickly develop a taste for the author, or you're repelled by the author. And I was thinking, I don't really consider Joyce to be a writer in English. I consider him to be a writer in Irish English.
Okay.
And Mark Twain is a writer of American English in the 19th century, and you can see the progression of his thought, as he writes, or Faulkner in the 20th century, and so what is the difference between reading somebody's work without having a translator? Like it's difficult to read like Proust without a translator if you don't read French, or like you talked about Gifford. I used who was this rascal? Yeah, Gifford.
Nice.
Side by side,
Yeah.
and that's where I got a breadcrumb about Laocoon and started following the trail of Lessing.
So do you think I'm just interested that you bring up like Gifford at the same time as Proust. Is it like Gifford is almost sort of our like translator of Ulysses?
Yeah, that's how I think of him. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I don't know how these guys did it before the internet.
Lots of stacks at the library, mystery.
Unbelievable.
Ages and ages. Terrible.
Yeah.
Was Joyce an acquired taste for you, or was there like, because I know like from my personal experience, I'll share the first couple times I read him in high school, and even the first couple years of my my undergrad, I was like, this guy sucks. Like his writing is so confusing for no reason. And then it kind of clicked, it took some time with me. So I don't know, like, have you sort of always been interested in Joyce, or was there a moment when it clicked and you were like, now I enjoy reading him? Or
oh yeah, very much so. I did. His short stories were they're more linear, I guess. I don't know if that's the correct word or not, but they were easier to follow. They seemed like they had a beginning, middle, and end. And what happened, I went to my wife is a real fan of Joyce, and she introduced me to Bloomsday readings. So we went to a small bookstore in a small Ohio town, and they were having a Bloomsday reading. I just thought we would be watching, and we got to be the main show because there wasn't anybody reading. So once I got over the problem of reading anything out loud, because the worry about mispronunciations, all that kind of stuff. I then went to another Joyce Bloomsday reading in Cleveland area, and there's where I met a bunch of people who were then going to study Ulysses later that fall. And so it was great. It was absolutely great. We met every week. We read a chapter a week, and you had mentioned that you did close reading. And by that time I was doing close reading too. I was retired. I had plenty of time. And that's when I just fell in love, especially when I hit the Proteus chapter and was able to make some heads and tails out of it, of my own meaning, So yeah, it was, I really started enjoying it very much. And then Finnegans Wake, I just thought was a hoot. Even the first time I read it, it was incomprehensible, but I thought it was so funny. And I still do.
That's amazing. Yeah. Wow. That's cool. I haven't managed to get all through Finnegans Wake yet. I'm like 100-ish pages from the end of the book right now. Well, thank you. But yeah, I've been surprised at how much I laugh. And sometimes I almost have to be like, man, like if somebody asked me why I was laughing right now, I couldn't explain it to them, but it's just somehow funny, even though it's nothing.
Yeah, well, I think it's punning. You get into that punning sense, and the just even the onomatopoeia of his of the words make me laugh because they, and the search for meaning. You realize, oh my God, he's talking about the major waste of time my brain does is trying to make meaning out of strange things,
Yeah.
and that's he's got that down right.
Wow. So you mentioned that you kind of like clicked into Joyce with Bloomsday readings. That's super cool. I feel like a lot more people than I was expecting had similar experiences. Not necessarily a Bloomsday, but just like being like their like entrance into Joyce was something other than his text, So do you have any other experiences like that of like sort of Joyce in the world?
The groups of people that I've read Joyce with, we've read them in people's homes, or we've read them at a local pub here in Cleveland.
Oh,
That's called Nighttown, after the Nighttown section of Dublin. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would read there, and we did Bloomsday readings there, and also Ulysses discussions there, chapter a week again. Yeah, it's very, very nice. Out in the world, and it brings out a different, just like any book does, any kind of dialogue with any human being, it brings out a different aspect of one's self, one's personality,
For sure.
And Joyce brings out a very earthy aspect, I think, of everybody's personality, which is always a surprise to people, no matter how highly educated they are, I think, or how literate or anything else. There's an earthy side of their nature that comes out reading him. And so it's very grounded.
What's your first run-in with Joyce? Like the very first time that you heard of him or tried to read him?
I don't remember why I knew about him. Probably because he was Irish and, was supposedly the greatest writer of the 20th century. And, my grandparents came from Ireland. So, I just had some pride there, probably some ethnic pride about it. I don't have my first edition of Ulysses, but I liked the cover of it when I saw it on the bookshelf, and so I think just that struck me. And then, I did not recognize the Odyssey. I was looking for the, just a linear tale again of like the Odyssey kind of told. And I didn't see anything about it, the Odyssey in there. Of course, that shows you how shallowly I had read the Odyssey as well,
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Like, I read the Iliad at the same time that I was reading Ulysses for the first time. And obviously that's like not as closely connected as the Odyssey, but there was something about reading Ulysses that kind of made me pay closer attention to Homer, or like pay attention to Homer in different ways than I think I would have,
Yeah.
It's wild how Ulysses kind of points you forward and back at the same time almost.
Absolutely agree with you. And I read the Aeneid last year too with this. And so reading Dante, the Aeneid and Ulysses creates a very interesting kind of historical play, of things. Yeah. Because Virgil was, Dante's guide through most of the Divine Comedy. And Aeneid is much more accessible than, in some regards, than Homer's Odyssey. But it's interesting. It's all those journeys.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting to see how it's continued on. And I feel like even things like looking at the Aeneid as, this like creation of a culture and of a people and all that sorts of things. And it's kind of like how that happens, or I guess happens like in the background of the Odyssey, and then how it's also happening in the background of Ulysses. To me, there's like little, almost like religious like backgrounds of how a people comes to be. And I think that Joyce is dealing with that, in especially like, to me, it stands out in the Cyclops episode where you've got this like violently anti-Semitic nationalism. And it's interesting to see Joyce say like, no, we can read this through like how, Odysseus's journey, or we can read this through, how Virgil describes Troy and all this stuff. And it's like, oh, okay, perfect.
Absolutely. That's a great point because, and that's a great episode too.
Mhm.
That is just as topical today. You could hear just those exact same kind of conversations taking
Mhm.
place in bars about who's a real American or who's a real Canadian.
Yeah, for
Or,
sure.
And there's always the other, and
Mhm.
it's probably Bloom at his most heroic and also at his most angry, uh,
Yes.
his reactions are kind of, I would say, almost un-Bloom like. And here he's standing up to one of the worst figures in Ulysses, And then, of course, in the very next episode, the citizen pops up again in the
Mhm.
form of his granddaughter,
Yes.
who's attracted to Bloom. So it's so strange how he weaves all that stuff in there,
Mhm. Yeah,
in a very natural way.
definitely. I've always thought probably one of like my, I don't know, like favorite line from Ulysses, not necessarily because it's beautiful, but when we're with like Gertie, like we're in Gertie McDowell's mind and she talks about like, oh, her like grandpa's lovely dog, Gary Owen. I'm always like, girl, what? Have you seen it?
He's almost human-like.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. And I think it's interesting how Joyce could like give us those two perspectives where in, Cyclops, it's like to me when I'm reading Cyclops, it seems so obvious that Joyce is criticizing this. And then in the very next episode, he's like, I don't know, maybe it's attractive and cute. Like who can tell? Like,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we just read that section last week,
Oh,
and
wow.
we're gonna finish the chapter this week. It's going to be on BBC World.
Wow.
They're gonna come and film it. Who knows what part they'll leave in? But yeah,
Mhm. That's exciting.
yeah.
Interesting for them to pick that episode. I guess it's quite a famous episode for
They didn't
caused
pick it. They
Ulysses some
just said,
trouble.
yeah, it did. It's what got it banned in America. But I don't think BBC World chose that. It was just that they wanted to film us, and that's what we're reading at the time.
I think it's great. That's
Yeah,
so
I agree with
perfect. That's a good coincidence.
Yeah, I agree. But what got you first interested in Joyce? You had talked about a very natural way, almost the same kind of way it happened to me, was you were bounced out of it, and
Mhm.
then all of a sudden something clicked for you.
Yes.
Can you remember what that was?
Oh, yes. I went to, so you said you read The Dead in January, so I think it might have been a similar event, but I went to, it's called The Dead 1904. It's this sort of off-Broadway show, and it's like interactive theater. So it's not on a stage. It's like the show takes place in this big, like early 20th century mansion, and you're like attending the Miss Morgan's party.
Nice.
Yes. And it was, it was that actually I remember very clearly because of course in the story, Gabriel kind of thinks of a way, his way to kind of like jab at Molly Ivors in his speech, but then she leaves. And so in his speech, he's talking about this like, oh, this like hyper educated, youth or whatever. And in the story, he's just kind of saying it abstractly. And the reader knows it's about Molly Ivors, but it could be about anyone for the characters, I think. But because it was interactive, we had a dialogue where he was like, like addressed me as like the hyper educated youth, and it's something about like being there in that moment and being able to like talk back to Gabriel Conroy, you know what I mean? I was like, I think that's what you were talking about with Bloom, is all of a sudden I just like saw how real the characters were, and I was like, I remember like halfway through that show thinking like, uh-oh, like now I'm in. Like he's got me.
The hook sunk deep.
Yes, exactly. So I think that's why I'm so interested in like how you too sort of had these like Bloomsday readings, that how a lot of the times like the thing that kind of gets us into Joyce is these like social relationships that are built around his texts almost more than the texts themselves.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a really nice way of saying it.
Oh, good.
So did you turn into a Joyce scholar then? You're in graduate school now, is that right?
Yeah, my first year of my master's.
What is it as you think of it right now? What would be a working title for your thesis?
Oh my gosh. Well, okay, I haven't thought of a working title before. I think I do love subtitles and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I know that my kind of the topic, what I'm interested in is Joyce and confession. And I think that
Oh,
yeah. And so, but there's so many ways to go because obviously he represents like the sacrament of confession in the like Catholic tradition, which is something that I'm interested in. But also there's this idea of like the confessional mode of literature, and then confession has to do with forgiveness. And a lot of times when you look at Joyce and forgiveness, it has to do with this like nationalist understanding of like how can Ireland forgive England, which I still don't think is a thing, you know? So I know that the like main title is Joyce and Confession, but which of those, which of those little strands I'll be able to follow, I think is still a work in progress. But
wow, that is something. That sounds wonderful.
thank you.
Yeah.
And I found it's very interesting when I don't, because I don't know, like, you don't have to tell me, but I've talked to like Ilaria and stuff. I think she's quite open about her Catholicism, and like me too. And so it's so interesting, like, to see from like our perspective, this thing, like the sacrament of confession that we like take part in, but also I think, especially when I was younger, it's this very like shameful thing. Like, you don't want anybody to see you go in there. You don't want to talk about it. And so like, to read Portrait, where Joyce, you know what I mean, where Joyce has like a whole chapter of Stephen like struggling and then ending up going to confession, it's just like, that's one of those like amazing moments of literature to me, where I'm like, how on earth did this get into a novel? I couldn't have imagined it. So
Yeah, that is really true. Well, I was raised Roman Catholic. I am a roaming Catholic now, if you will.
love that.
And so, Joyce puts in so much. It just absolutely amazes me when especially with Hinduism, and it's like he really anticipated a lot of modern Catholic theologians in that. You can read Jesuit theologians who are profoundly influenced by Hinduism. And so he just quotes stuff from the text, the ancient Vedic texts that it's just incredible. So yeah, where he had the time, I don't know. Then at the same time, like I remember one of the first times I was reading Ulysses with a group, and this one person, we were in the very second episode, with Deasy, and she said, Bill, do you think that James Joyce didn't believe in God? Now, I'm just going to suspend my own opinions on the subject, but I said, well, look, he says it right here. He says he's talking to Deasy, and he says, you want to hear the sound of God? There, it's the sound of children. It's the sound of what's going on right now, right outside. That's the sound of God. I said, so of course he believed in God. It's just he didn't believe in God the same way that he used to believe in God. And who does? If they think they ever get one notion of God, they're stuck with that for their life. Okay, that works. Go ahead. But that's not what I think he was very superstitious, and at the same time, and very irreverent, and at the same time, very deeply touched by that. We in the last reading we had there's what do we call it? The Nicene Creed.
Mhm.
Okay, so in Ulysses, and I won't take time to get it, in that particular episode, the Nausicaa episode, he talks about, he gives a parody of the Nicene Creed from the perspective of the English Navy. And and I mentioned that, and people didn't seem to even pick up on it, but it just absolutely amazes me when he's both irreverent and deeply touched by all that stuff.
For sure. And I think it's so interesting, like you said, and I've been talking to like a couple other people from the Sweeney's group about how some things are just like so obvious to other people, and others of us have to like, you know, just search and like spend hours in the library to figure this out. And it is so interesting that things like with that, I know the passage you're talking about with the Nicene Creed, and it's so like the people who would recognize that and see what he's doing are probably the ones who are most uncomfortable with how irreverent it is, you know?
Or they have to be Catholic.
Yeah,
They have to have been Roman Catholic to pick it
you
up.
have to be raised Roman Catholic to understand this kind of like diss on Roman Catholicism. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And it's just, you know, and the way he does it is, it makes you laugh, you know. Oh, here it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not in Nausicaa. It's in they believe in Rod, the Scourger Almighty, creator of hell upon earth, and in Jackie Tar, the son of a gun, who was conceived of an unholy boast, born of the fighting navy, suffered under rump and dozen, was scarified, flayed, and curried, yelled like Buddy Hell. The third day he rose again from the bed, steered into haven, sitteth on his beam end till further orders, whence he shall come to drudge for a living and be paid. Is that not wonderful?
It's fantastic.
I mean, I've got an exclamation point right next to it. And it's from the Cyclops.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in Cyclops. So if you ever wanted to see it again, but yeah, you know, with the confession, I think that's really brilliant, because, you know, that's that intersection of faith that is between oneself, the Almighty, if we call it that, and then the necessary human being that has to be there to make it real. You know, that's the confessor, you know.
Yes.
And
Wow.
and that religious act, you know.
Mm-hmm. No,
Yeah,
totally
so I think that's brilliant. I think you're gonna go really far with that.
Thank you.
I really enjoy him, and I enjoy the real Bloom as well. My own version in my own mind of both.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I feel like I hope that that's something people are taking away from these conversations. You know what I mean? Is that what I've realized anyway? Is that everyone, like I've had people that I'm like interview on the same day, and they'll just happen to pick the same passage or the same character to talk about, and it's like completely different things, but like I'm equally convinced by both, you know, like they're both correct. They're both right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is there anything that's like will be memorable to you about like this conversation that we had? Like anything that clicked in your head as you were talking, or anything you got to share that you haven't really tried before?
Well, yeah, you know, I would say I feel validated by it, right? And because your enthusiasm really validates mine. Now, and one of the things that I really feel about all of Joyce is that he is so deep, and at the same time so shallow. I mean, he is that, like, he thinks he's writing something funny, and he's writing something profound. Right? Wow. And we don't ever know what we're going to convey to somebody, you know, and so yeah, I just feel validated by the conversation, and that makes me want to study him more.